The morning sun cast long shadows across the campus as Eleanor Mills clutched her worn backpack to her chest. At 42, she stood out among the sea of young faces rushing between buildings, their expensive clothes and carefree laughter a stark contrast to her simple blue dress and tired eyes. Her hands, rough from years of scrubbing floors and wiping windows, gripped a campus map that she'd picked up from the community center, where she'd first heard about the university's outreach program. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, taking a deep breath as she approached the imposing mathematics building. Its stone walls and grand entrance made her feel even smaller than she already did. Eleanor had always loved numbers. As a child, she would solve puzzles for fun, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. Life had taken her down a different path, though. Dreams of college faded when her father got sick. Then came an early marriage, bills to pay, and before she knew it, 20 years had slipped by. Now she cleaned offices at night and until recently had accepted that this would be her life forever. But the flyer about free university classes for community members had rekindled something inside her. Why not? She had thought, applying for the advanced calculus class despite the requirement that participants have prior mathematical knowledge. Eleanor hadn't mentioned her high school math awards or the dog-eared textbooks she still studied late at night. She simply wrote that she was good with numbers and hoped it would be enough. Somehow it had been. And now here she was, climbing the steps to Professor Harrington's classroom, 10 minutes early because she couldn't bear the thought of walking in late. The lecture hall was nearly empty when she arrived, with only a few students scattered among the rows of seats. Eleanor chose a spot in the back corner, hoping to blend in as much as possible. She carefully arranged her new notebook and 3 freshly sharpened pencils on the desk, a small luxury she had allowed herself for this new beginning. As the room filled up, Eleanor kept her eyes down, focusing on the blank page before her. The seats around her remained empty, despite the room becoming crowded. She could hear whispers and feel curious glances, but she pretended not to notice. Is she in the right room? Maybe she's someone's mom. No way she's taking this class. The words stung, but Eleanor had expected this. She straightened her back and waited for the professor. Professor Richard Harrington entered exactly at 9. His tailored suit and confident stride commanding immediate attention. His gaze swept over the class, pausing briefly when he noticed Eleanor in the back. A slight frown crossed his face before he turned to the whiteboard. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus 301, he announced. "If you're looking for math for everyday life, that's down the hall in room 110. He looked directly at Eleanor as he said this, causing several students to snicker. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn but kept her expression neutral. "I'm in the right place," she said quietly. Professor Harrington raised an eyebrow. "Well then, let's begin." For the next hour, Eleanor took careful notes as the professor outlined the course expectations and reviewed fundamental concepts. His teaching style was brisk and demanding, with occasional barbed comments aimed at students who seemed confused. When he asked questions, his eyes never moved toward Eleanor's corner of the room. As the class ended, Eleanor gathered her things slowly, waiting for the rush of students to clear. A young man in an expensive sweater bumped her desk as he passed. "Sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Didn't see you there. You know, the cleaning staff usually comes in after hours." His friends laughed as they filed out, leaving Eleanor alone with her burning embarrassment. She was, in fact, part of the cleaning staff. 3 nights a week she cleaned the science buildings, including this one. She had never mentioned this when applying to the program, worried it might somehow disqualify her. Now she wondered if everyone somehow knew. Eleanor was about to leave when Professor Harrington called out to her. "Miss, I don't believe I caught your name." "Mills," she replied. "Eleanor Mills." "Ms. Mills, may I ask what brings you to my class?" His tone wasn't exactly unfriendly, but there was something challenging in it. Eleanor clutched her notebook tighter. "I've always loved mathematics. I wanted to learn more." "This is an advanced course," he said, shuffling papers on his desk without looking at her. "Most students have years of prerequisite classes before attempting it." "I understand the material so far," Eleanor said. "If I fall behind, I'll withdraw." Professor Harrington looked up then, studying her with clinical interest. "Very well. I suppose the outreach program exists for a reason. Just try not to slow the class down." Eleanor nodded and left quickly, her victory at standing her ground overshadowed by the knowledge that the professor, like his students, had already decided she didn't belong. The rest of the week followed a similar pattern. Eleanor would arrive early, sit in her corner, and take meticulous notes. During group exercises, no one chose to work with her, so she solved problems alone. Sometimes her approaches differed from those the professor taught, methods she had discovered through years of self-study, but she kept these to herself, carefully copying the correct procedures instead. At night, she would return to the campus with her cleaning cart, moving quietly through the hallways she had walked as a student hours before. Sometimes she would pause in empty classrooms, looking at complex equations left on boards, working through them in her mind as she dusted desks and emptied trash cans. 2 weeks into the semester, Eleanor was wiping down the tables in the mathematics faculty lounge when she overheard Professor Harrington speaking with a colleague. "I have this cleaner in my calculus class now," he said with a laugh, part of that community program the dean's so proud of. "How's she doing?" the other professor asked. "She hasn't dropped out yet, surprisingly. Sits in the back, never speaks. Probably doesn't understand a word I'm saying." He sighed dramatically. These publicity stunts make a mockery of academic standards. Eleanor froze behind the half-closed door, her cleaning cloth suspended mid-wipe. "Maybe she's smarter than you think," the colleague suggested. "Please, I've been teaching for 20 years. I know potential when I see it." Professor Harrington's voice dripped with certainty. "Some people just aren't cut out for higher mathematics." Eleanor slipped away before they could notice her, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and anger. That night she stayed up late reviewing the chapter they would cover the next day, determined to understand every concept perfectly. The following class, Professor Harrington introduced partial differentiation with multiple variables. Eleanor noticed several students looking confused as the equations grew more complex across the board. She followed along carefully, catching a small error in one of the professor's examples but remaining silent about it. As the class progressed, she felt a growing confidence. This material made sense to her in a way that few things in life did. Numbers had rules, patterns, and beautiful consistency. Unlike people, equations didn't judge you based on your clothes or your job. Her thoughts were interrupted when she realized Professor Harrington was looking directly at her. "Ms. Mills," he said, his voice carrying a note of challenge, "you've been very quiet these past weeks. Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on this approach?" The entire class turned to look at her, expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled amusement. Eleanor felt her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm following along fine," she said softly. "That wasn't my question," Professor Harrington replied. "Do you understand the material or not?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, I believe I do. You believe?" He raised an eyebrow. "Mathematics isn't about belief, Ms. Mills, it's about demonstration." He turned back to the board. "We'll see soon enough, I suppose. The first exam is next Friday." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room. Eleanor sank lower in her seat, wishing she could disappear. The student beside her, a young woman who had at least never been openly rude, gave her a look that might have been sympathy before turning back to her notes. That evening, as Eleanor mopped the floors of the mathematics building, she paused outside Professor Harrington's office. Through the glass panel in the door, she could see stacks of papers, books, and a framed photograph of him shaking hands with someone important-looking. On his whiteboard were notes for tomorrow's lecture, more complex than what he'd covered in class. Eleanor studied the equations, mentally working through them. There was an elegance to them that made her forget for a moment about her aching feet and the humiliation of the day. This was why she had come here, for the beauty of mathematics itself, not for acceptance from people like Richard Harrington. As she pushed her cart toward the next room, Eleanor made a decision. She would stay in this class no matter how uncomfortable it made her. She would take the tests, do the work, and prove to herself, if to no one else, that she belonged in that room not just as someone who cleaned it, but as someone who understood what happened there. What she didn't know then was how soon that proof would be demanded of her, or how dramatically it would change everything. The first exam came and went. Eleanor sat hunched over her paper in the back corner, working methodically through each problem. She noticed Professor Harrington watching her with narrowed eyes as she turned in her test, one of the last students to finish. Not because she struggled, but because she triple-checked every answer, afraid to make even the smallest mistake. For the next week, Eleanor felt the weight of anticipation every time she entered the classroom. The graded exams remained unreturned, and she wondered if Professor Harrington was saving some special humiliation for her. On Friday morning, he strode into the lecture hall holding a stack of papers, his expression unreadable. "Overall, I'm disappointed," he announced. "The average score was a 76. Many of you clearly aren't putting in the necessary effort." He began calling students forward alphabetically. Some returned to their seats looking relieved, others dejected. Eleanor waited, her stomach in knots, watching the stack of papers grow smaller. "Ms. Mills." Eleanor walked to the front, aware of the eyes following her. Professor Harrington held out her exam, but as she reached for it, he kept his grip. "Interesting approach on problem 4, he said quietly, just for her ears. "Not what I taught in class." Eleanor swallowed hard. She had solved that particular integral using a technique she'd discovered in an old textbook found at a second-hand shop. It worked, but it wasn't standard. "I got the right answer," she whispered. "Yes," he admitted, releasing the paper. "You did." Eleanor glanced down at her exam as she walked back to her seat. A red 94% stared back at her, the highest score he'd called out so far. Her heart should have soared, but instead it sank. She had drawn attention to herself. Exactly what she'd been trying to avoid. Sure enough, the whispers started immediately. "Did you see that? No way she got that on her own. Bet she cheated somehow." Professor Harrington cleared his throat. "Before we move on to new material, I want to discuss problem 4, which many of you struggled with." He wrote a complex integral on the board, then turned to face the class. "Would anyone care to demonstrate the solution?" "Perhaps." His eyes found Eleanor. "Ms. Mills, since you had such an unconventional approach." The room fell silent. This wasn't a request, but a challenge. Eleanor felt trapped. If she refused, she'd appear incapable. If she accepted, she'd have to stand before everyone and risk making a mistake. "I'd rather not," she said softly. Professor Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come now, Ms. Mills. Part of the learning process is sharing techniques. Surely you're not shy about your method. Unless, of course, you're not confident in it." The implication was clear. He was suggesting she hadn't arrived at the answer honestly. Eleanor slowly gathered her notebook and pencil. Her legs felt weak as she made her way to the front of the room. The walk seemed endless, each step taking her further from the safety of anonymity. Standing before the whiteboard, she took a deep breath and began writing. Her hand trembled at first, but steadied as the familiar comfort of mathematics took over. She worked through the problem step by step, explaining quietly as she went. "When you look at this form, you can see it relates to the natural logarithm. So instead of using the substitution method from class, I recognized it as..." She could feel Professor Harrington hovering nearby, watching for any mistake. When she finished and stepped back from the board, the silence in the room had a different quality to it, something like surprise. "That's correct," Professor Harrington said finally, a hint of confusion in his voice, though I've never seen the problem approached quite that way. "Where did you learn this method?" "I read a lot," Eleanor replied simply. Professor Harrington studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Back to your seat, Ms. Mills." For the rest of the class, Eleanor felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The students on either side of her no longer leaned away quite so obviously. One young man even gave her a respectful nod as they packed up to leave. But if Eleanor thought this small success would ease her path, she was mistaken. Professor Harrington seemed to take her performance as a personal challenge. In the following weeks, he called on her repeatedly, always with the most difficult questions. Each time, Eleanor answered correctly, though often in ways that made the professor frown in thought. One rainy Tuesday, a month into the semester, Eleanor arrived to find a substitute teacher. A ripple of disappointment went through the class, not because they missed Professor Harrington, but because a substitute meant a wasted day of review rather than new material. Professor Harrington had an unexpected meeting, the substitute explained. A kind-faced older woman who introduced herself as Dr. Chen. He left instructions for a review session. The class settled into bored silence as Dr. Chen distributed worksheet packets. Eleanor tackled hers with her usual care, finishing well before the others. As she waited, she noticed Dr. Chen watching her with interest. After class, as Eleanor was putting away her things, Dr. Chen approached her desk. "You're Eleanor Mills, yes?" she asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, suddenly wary. "Richard, Professor Harrington, mentioned you to me." Dr. Chen's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "He said you have an unusual approach to calculus. Is that a problem?" Eleanor asked. Dr. Chen smiled. "Not at all. Mathematics needs fresh perspectives." She hesitated, then added, "Though Richard doesn't always appreciate being surprised in his own classroom." Eleanor understood the warning. "I'm not trying to cause trouble." "No, I don't imagine you are." Dr. Chen studied her for a moment. "You know, there's a special lecture series on Thursday evenings in the mathematics department. Visiting scholars, new research. You might find it interesting." Eleanor shook her head regretfully. "I work evenings." "Ah." Dr. Chen looked disappointed. "Well, if your schedule ever changes." She nodded goodbye and left Eleanor wondering why a professor she'd never met before would take an interest in her. The answer came sooner than expected. The following day, Professor Harrington returned, his manner even more brusque than usual. He barely looked at Eleanor as he launched into a lecture on differential equations, writing across the board with sharp, angry strokes. As the class progressed, Eleanor noticed something odd. The examples he was using were far more advanced than anything they'd covered so far. Looking around, she could see confusion on many faces as he introduced concepts that clearly weren't in the current chapter. "Now," Professor Harrington said, turning to face the class with an expression that made Eleanor's stomach tighten, "let's see who's been keeping up with the readings. This is a practical application that combines several concepts we've touched on." He wrote a massive multi-part equation on the board. It stretched across the entire surface, filled with Greek symbols and nested parentheses. Even the best students were exchanging worried glances. "This represents the oscillation patterns in a complex mechanical system," he explained. "I'd like someone to identify the critical failure point. Any volunteers?" The silence was absolute. No hands went up. "No one?" Professor Harrington's gaze swept the room, finally settling on Eleanor. "Ms. Mills, perhaps you'd like to try?" Given your intuitive grasp of mathematics, it wasn't a request. The way he emphasized intuitive made it sound like an insult. Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't just difficult, it was beyond the scope of the class entirely. She recognized elements of partial differential equations and vector calculus that weren't even on the syllabus. "Professor," one brave student spoke up, "we haven't covered this material yet, haven't we?" Professor Harrington replied mildly, "My mistake. But since it's on the board, let's use it as a learning opportunity." "Ms. Mills?" Eleanor slowly rose from her seat. The walk to the front felt like moving through water, every step an effort against the current of dread flowing through her. She felt the eyes of every student, sensed their mixture of relief that they hadn't been chosen, and anticipation of the entertainment about to unfold. She stood before the board, staring at the sprawling equation. Professor Harrington thrust a marker into her hand, then stepped back, arms folded. "Take your time," he said, his tone making it clear he expected her to fail, though not too much time. "We have a lot to cover today." Eleanor took a deep breath. She looked at the equation again, trying to see past its intimidating appearance to the patterns underneath. And then, like a photograph coming into focus, she began to see connections. This wasn't just random symbols thrown together to confuse her. There was logic here. Beauty, even. With a steadier hand than she felt, she raised the marker to the board and began to work. The classroom was absolutely silent as Eleanor studied the massive equation. She could feel sweat forming on her brow under the harsh fluorescent lights. Professor Harrington stood to the side, arms crossed, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He was enjoying this. Eleanor took a deep breath. She had two choices: give up and walk away in humiliation, or try. And Eleanor Mills had never been one to walk away. "The critical failure point," she murmured almost to herself. "First, I need to understand what this system represents." She examined the equation carefully, identifying familiar patterns within the complexity. This wasn't just calculus. It combined elements of differential equations, vector analysis, and what looked like quantum mechanics. Far beyond what any undergraduate class would cover. "This is modeling wave functions," she said, her voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "But there's something odd about the boundary conditions." She began writing, breaking down the equation into manageable parts. Her hand moved with surprising confidence, filling the remaining space on the whiteboard with steps and annotations. When she ran out of room, she erased a section of the original problem that she'd already processed and continued working. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The initial shuffling and whispering of the class had died away to stunned silence. Even Professor Harrington's smug expression had faded into something more complex. Confusion mixed with reluctant interest. "There's an inconsistency here," Eleanor said, tapping her marker against a particular symbol. "If this represents the physical system you described, this term shouldn't behave this way unless—" She paused, frowning at the board. Something wasn't adding up. She traced backward through her work, checking each step. Then she saw it. A subtle but critical error in the original equation. Eleanor turned to face Professor Harrington. "The problem as written doesn't have a valid failure point, because there's an error in the formulation. This term here," she pointed to a specific part of the original equation, "creates a physical impossibility. If you correct it to this," she wrote a modified version, "then the critical failure occurs when these two expressions become equal." She wrote out the final answer, circled it, and stepped back. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Professor Harrington stared at the board, his face unreadable. Then he stepped forward, examining Eleanor's work line by line. The class watched, barely breathing. Finally, he turned to Eleanor. "You're right," he said, his voice tight with some emotion she couldn't identify. "There was a deliberate error in the problem, and you not only found it, but corrected it and solved the adjusted equation perfectly." The admission seemed to cost him considerable effort. He looked at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. "Where did you learn to do this level of mathematics, Ms. Mills?" Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Books," she said simply. "I read a lot of books." "No," Professor Harrington shook his head. "This isn't something you pick up from recreational reading. This is graduate-level work." "Who taught you?" The question hung in the air. The entire class was staring at her, their expressions ranging from confusion to awe. The young man who had been the first to mock her, the one who'd mistaken her for cleaning staff, had his mouth slightly open in disbelief. "No one taught me," Eleanor said quietly. "I just see it." Professor Harrington's eyes narrowed. "That's not possible." "It is for her," a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Dr. Chen standing there, a small smile on her face. "I wondered if you'd go through with it, Richard," she said, stepping into the room. "Setting an impossible problem to prove a point." Professor Harrington's face flushed slightly. "It wasn't impossible. It was advanced. And deliberately misleading," Dr. Chen added, turning to address the class. "What you've just witnessed is quite remarkable. Your classmate has just solved a problem that typically challenges our second-year graduate students." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Eleanor stood awkwardly by the board, marker still in hand, wishing she could disappear. "Class dismissed," Professor Harrington announced abruptly. "Read Chapter 7 for Friday." As the students gathered their things, many cast curious glances at Eleanor. She returned to her desk, hands trembling slightly as she packed up her notebook. The atmosphere had changed, she could feel it. No one was sneering now. A tall young woman with glasses who sat 2 rows away approached Eleanor's desk. "That was amazing," she said quietly. "Truly." Eleanor managed a small smile in return, unsure how to respond to praise after weeks of disdain. As the last students filed out, Professor Harrington called, "Ms. Mills, a word, please." Eleanor approached the front of the room cautiously. Dr. Chen stood nearby, her presence somehow reassuring. "I owe you an apology," Professor Harrington said stiffly. The words seemed to physically pain him. "I made assumptions about you that were clearly incorrect." "We both did," Dr. Chen added. "When Richard mentioned your unusual approaches, I suspected you might have some untrained talent. But this," she gestured to the board where Eleanor's work still filled every available space, "this is exceptional." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. "I should get to my next class." "Wait," Professor Harrington said. "I need to understand. You're telling me you have no formal training beyond high school mathematics? That's simply not believable." "Richard," Dr. Chen warned. "No, it's okay," Eleanor said. "I did well in high school math, but I couldn't go to college then. My dad got sick my senior year, and someone had to care for him and work to pay the bills. That was me." "And since then?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Eleanor shrugged. I read books. I find old textbooks at thrift stores, library sales. I work through them at night. It calms my mind. Professor Harrington was shaking his head. This goes beyond self-teaching from textbooks. What you just did involves intuitive leaps that most trained mathematicians wouldn't make. I don't know what to tell you, Eleanor said. Numbers just make sense to me. They always have. She glanced at the clock on the wall. I really should go. Of course, Dr. Chen said. But Ms. Mills, Eleanor, would you be willing to meet with us again? Perhaps tomorrow during office hours. Eleanor hesitated. I work days at the hospital cafeteria, then classes. Then I clean here at night. When do you sleep? Professor Harrington asked, sounding genuinely curious. When I can, Eleanor replied with a small smile. I could come early tomorrow before my shift. Around 6? I'll be here, Dr. Chen said immediately. Professor Harrington nodded reluctantly. As will I. Eleanor slipped out of the classroom and hurried down the hallway, her mind spinning. For years she'd kept her love of mathematics private, a secret joy, a personal escape. Now it was exposed, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. That evening, as Eleanor pushed her cleaning cart through the mathematics building, she noticed students looking at her differently. Word had spread. A few nodded in recognition. One even stopped to tell her that what she'd done in class was seriously cool. When she reached the lecture hall where it had all happened, she paused. Her work was still on the whiteboard, untouched. Beside it, someone had added a note. Do not erase, Dr. Harrington. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, looking at her own handwriting sprawled across the board. For the first time in years, she felt something like pride. Later that night, as Eleanor walked to the bus stop after finishing her shift, she noticed Professor Harrington's car still in the parking lot. Through the window of his office, she could see him hunched over his desk, surrounded by books and papers. He was tracing something with his finger, following her solution from a copy he must have made. The next morning arrived all too quickly. Eleanor had barely slept, her mind too full of questions about what this meeting might mean. She arrived at Professor Harrington's office at exactly 6 o'clock, hair still damp from her hurried shower, wearing her cafeteria uniform under her coat. To her surprise, there were 3 people waiting, not 2. Dr. Chen sat comfortably in an armchair, while Professor Harrington stood stiffly behind his desk. The third person, a distinguished-looking older man with silver hair, rose as she entered. Eleanor Mills, he said warmly, extending his hand. I'm Dean Walker. I've heard quite a remarkable story about you. Eleanor cautiously shook the dean's hand, her mind racing. Why would the head of the entire university be interested in her? She glanced at Professor Harrington, whose tight expression revealed little, then at Dr. Chen, who offered an encouraging smile. Please, sit down. Dean Walker gestured to the empty chair. I hope you don't mind the early hour. When Dr. Chen called me last night about what happened in yesterday's class, I felt we should talk right away. Eleanor perched on the edge of the chair. I'm not in trouble, am I? The dean laughed warmly. Quite the opposite. Ms. Mills, it seems you've done something rather extraordinary. I just solved a math problem, Eleanor said quietly. Not just any problem, Professor Harrington interjected. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept much. After you left yesterday, I spent hours reviewing your work. Your approach was unorthodox but elegant. I've shown it to several colleagues. No one has seen anything quite like it. Which brings us to why I'm here. Dean Walker leaned forward. Ms. Mills, have you ever published any mathematical work? Under any name? The question hung in the air. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. This was the moment she'd both feared and secretly hoped for. Yes, she admitted softly. A long time ago. Professor Harrington's head snapped up. What? Where? Under what name? E.M. Gray, Eleanor said. The effect was immediate. Professor Harrington's eyes widened in shock. Dr. Chen gasped audibly. Even the dean looked startled. You're E.M. Gray? Professor Harrington's voice was barely a whisper. But that's impossible. Gray published 3 groundbreaking papers on nonlinear equations almost 20 years ago, then disappeared completely. The work was revolutionary but incomplete. Everyone in the field has wondered what happened. Life happened, Eleanor said simply. My father's illness got worse. The medical bills piled up. I couldn't focus on theoretical mathematics while working 3 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. She looked down at her hands. Working hands. rough and cracked from years of cleaning chemicals. After Dad died, I kept meaning to go back to it. But then I got married. My husband lost his job, started drinking. By the time I left him, I was deep in debt, and mathematical theory seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Dean Walker was the first to speak. Ms. Mills, Eleanor, the work you did as E.M. Gray has been built upon by dozens of mathematicians since. It formed the foundation for advances in several fields. Did you know that? Eleanor shook her head. I stopped following academic journals years ago. Too painful. Your third paper on predictive modeling of chaotic systems is required reading in our graduate program, Dr. Chen said gently. I teach it every year. Eleanor felt a strange tightness in her chest, pride mixed with regret for all the lost years. Professor Harrington was still staring at her as if she were a ghost. I cited your work in my doctoral thesis, he said, his voice oddly vulnerable. Your approach to boundary conditions changed how I thought about the entire field. I've been cleaning your office for 3 months, Eleanor said with a small smile. I've dusted your thesis on the shelf every week. The absurdity of it, the author of groundbreaking mathematical theory reduced to cleaning the offices of those who studied her work, hung in the air between them. Professor Harrington had the grace to look ashamed. Ms. Mills, Dean Walker said, I believe we have an opportunity here to right a wrong. The university has a special fund for exceptional cases. I'd like to offer you a position, a fellowship that would allow you to continue your education formally while also pursuing your own research. Eleanor's breath caught. I couldn't possibly— You absolutely could, Dr. Chen interrupted firmly. Your work as E.M. Gray alone would qualify you, even without your remarkable demonstration yesterday. But my jobs— My bills, Eleanor started. The fellowship includes a stipend, Dean Walker assured her. Enough to live on comfortably while you study. And there might be teaching opportunities as well if you're interested. Eleanor felt dizzy. Was this really happening? After all these years of dreaming, of solving equations in stolen moments between shifts, of reading mathematical journals in the library on her rare days off? I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, Dr. Chen urged. Professor Harrington cleared his throat. For what it's worth, Ms. Mills, I would consider it a privilege to work with you rather than, well, to have you work for me. He looked directly at her, professional pride warring with genuine respect in his expression. I was wrong about you, and I apologize. Eleanor felt tears threatening. She blinked them back, unwilling to cry in front of these people. Could I have some time to think about it? Of course, Dean Walker said, rising. But not too long. News like this travels fast in academic circles. Once word gets out that E.M. Gray has resurfaced— I understand, Eleanor nodded. I'll have an answer for you by Monday. As she left the office, her mind was spinning. The cafeteria would be expecting her in 30 minutes. The apartment rent was due next week. She had a life, a hard, exhausting life, but one she understood. This offer would change everything. The day passed in a blur. Eleanor served food, smiled at students, some of whom now recognized her and whispered excitedly to their friends, and tried to make sense of what was happening. During her break, she called her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had become a surrogate mother over the years. They want to give me a fellowship, Eleanor explained, still unable to believe it herself. About time someone saw how smart you are, Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. You take it, girl. You've been cleaning up other people's messes long enough. By the time Eleanor arrived at the mathematics building for her evening cleaning shift, she'd made her decision. But something unexpected awaited her. A small crowd of students was gathered in the lobby talking excitedly. When they saw her, they fell silent. Then the tall young woman with glasses, the one who had called her work amazing the day before, stepped forward. We heard about you, she said. That you're actually E.M. Gray. We're all studying your paper in advanced theory class, and we wondered if you might explain some of it to us. Eleanor looked at their eager faces, the same students who had ignored or mocked her just weeks before. Now they were looking at her with something like awe. I'm supposed to be cleaning, she said uncertainly. We got permission from building services, another student chimed in, just for tonight. We booked a study room and everything. Eleanor hesitated. Then she remembered the years of loneliness, of having complex mathematical ideas bursting in her mind with no one to share them with. She thought of all the times she'd wanted to join a discussion in class but had held back, afraid of drawing attention. "All right," she agreed. "Let me get my cart put away." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor sat in a study room with 8 fascinated students, breaking down concepts she hadn't discussed with anyone in nearly 20 years. It felt rusty at first, then increasingly natural. She found herself drawing diagrams, getting excited about ideas, building on questions they asked. When she finally noticed the time, she was shocked. "It's nearly 10. I need to finish my rounds, and can we do this again tomorrow?" someone asked. Eleanor smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I think I might be a bit busy tomorrow. And in the days after that." As she finished her cleaning duties that night, Eleanor felt a strange new lightness. For so long she had been invisible, just another middle-aged woman in a service job, someone whose thoughts and dreams were assumed to be as simple as her circumstances. When she reached Professor Harrington's office, she paused. Through the window, she could see him still at his desk, reading something intently. With a start, she realized it was one of her papers, the actual journal, yellowed with age. She knocked softly. When he looked up, she said through the door, "I'll take the fellowship." His face broke into the first genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. "Good," he said simply. "We have a lot of work to do." As Eleanor wheeled her cart toward the elevator for the last time, she realized something important had shifted inside her. The halls she walked, the rooms she cleaned, they were no longer spaces she merely serviced. Soon they would be spaces where she belonged. 6 months later, Eleanor stood at the front of a lecture hall, chalk in hand, explaining a concept to a room full of attentive students. The change in her life had been so swift and complete that sometimes she still couldn't believe it. The fellowship had come with its own office. A small one, but with a window and her name on the door. Eleanor Mills, PhD candidate and research fellow. She'd protested the expense, but Dean Walker had insisted. "Your identity as E.M. Gray is going to come out eventually," he'd said. "We might as well make it official." And come out it had. Within weeks of accepting the position, Eleanor had found herself fielding calls from mathematical journals, requests for interviews, and even a few tentative job offers from other universities. The story of the cleaning lady who turned out to be a mathematical genius had spread far beyond campus. But Eleanor had stayed, drawn by the genuine support offered by Dr. Chen and, surprisingly, by Professor Harrington himself. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted, a wary respect that gradually became a true collaboration. Today's lecture was part of a special seminar series she'd been asked to teach, focused on her unique approach to complex systems. The room was packed, not just with regular students, but with faculty members and even a few visitors from other universities. "So you see," Eleanor concluded, setting down her chalk, "when we approach these equations as patterns rather than just rules, new possibilities emerge. The boundaries we thought were fixed become flexible." She smiled at the sea of faces, no longer feeling like an imposter. "Any questions?" Hands shot up across the room. Eleanor called on a young man in the front row. "Dr. Mills," he began, using the honorary title many had started calling her despite her protests that she hadn't earned her doctorate yet. "How did you first develop this approach? Was there a specific problem you were trying to solve?" Eleanor leaned against the desk, considering. "Actually, yes, but not a mathematical problem, at least not at first." She looked out at the expectant faces. "I was 16, working part-time at a fabric store to help my family make ends meet. The owner needed to maximize the number of patterns that could be cut from different fabric widths while minimizing waste." She smiled at the memory. It was a practical problem with real consequences. Every wasted inch of fabric was money lost. I started playing with arrangements, drawing diagrams. Eventually, I realized it was a mathematical problem of optimization with multiple constraints. A young woman with curly hair raised her hand. "So your breakthrough came from a real-world problem, not an abstract one?" "Exactly," Eleanor nodded. "I think sometimes we isolate mathematics too much, treat it as something separate from the world. But the most elegant solutions often come when we connect abstract thinking to concrete reality." After the lecture, as students filed out, Professor Harrington approached her. In the months since the discovery of her identity, he had undergone his own transformation. The arrogance remained, but it was tempered now with genuine curiosity. "Interesting lecture," he said, "though I noticed you didn't use any of the standard notation for boundary conditions." Eleanor smiled. "Old habits. When you learn from books instead of teachers, you sometimes develop your own shorthand." "It's more intuitive," he admitted. "I'm thinking of adopting it for my graduate seminar." Coming from him, this was high praise indeed. "I'm flattered," Eleanor said. "Don't be," he replied with a wry smile. "I'm stealing your ideas because they're better than mine. That's how academia works." He hesitated, then added, "The department meeting is at 4. We'll be discussing the new outreach initiative. Your perspective would be valuable." Eleanor nodded. "I'll be there." As Professor Harrington left, Eleanor gathered her notes. The outreach initiative was her brainchild, a program designed to identify and support non-traditional students with mathematical talent. She'd fought hard for it, drawing on her own experience to argue that brilliance didn't always follow conventional paths. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat in the math department's conference room, listening as faculty members debated the details of the new program. The discussion had been going for nearly an hour when there was a knock at the door. A young woman in a custodial uniform entered, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, looking uncomfortable. "I can come back later." "No need," Dr. Chen said kindly. "We're almost finished. Please go ahead." As the young woman began emptying trash cans, Eleanor noticed something. While the others continued their discussion, the custodian was glancing at the equations on the whiteboard, her eyes moving across the complex symbols with unmistakable comprehension. When the meeting ended and faculty began to file out, Eleanor stayed behind. The young woman was wiping down the whiteboard, carefully working around the equations. "You understand what those mean, don't you?" Eleanor asked quietly. The custodian froze, then turned around slowly. I was just cleaning." "But you were reading them too," Eleanor pressed gently. "It's okay. I used to clean this building myself." The young woman's eyes widened in recognition. "You're her. The one they talk about. The cleaning lady who turned out to be some math genius." Eleanor smiled. "I'm Eleanor Mills, and you are?" "Lucia Rodriguez," the young woman replied. "I'm just working here while I take classes at the community college. I can't afford university tuition. What are you studying?" "Engineering, hopefully." "I'm good with numbers, but—" She shrugged. "It's a long road." Eleanor glanced at the whiteboard. "Those equations we were working on, what did you think of them?" Lucia hesitated, looking as if she was trying to decide whether this was some kind of trap. Finally, she said, "There's a simpler way to express the relationship. If you group these terms differently." Eleanor handed her a marker. "Show me." Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Lucia wrote out an alternative formulation. Eleanor watched, a strange sense of déjà vu washing over her. How many brilliant minds were out there, hidden behind uniforms and name tags invisible to the academic world. "Lucia," she said when the young woman finished, "I'd like to talk to you about a new program we're starting. Would you have time for coffee after your shift?" The surprise and hope in Lucia's eyes reminded Eleanor of how she had felt 6 months ago, standing in the dean's office as doors she'd thought forever closed suddenly swung open. That evening, Eleanor walked across campus toward her car. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quad. Students lounged on the grass, laughing and talking. A few waved to her as she passed. No longer the invisible cleaning lady, but Dr. Mills, the professor whose classes they hoped to take. She paused outside the mathematics building, looking up at the windows where lights still burned as dedicated researchers worked into the evening. Her window was among them, her own research finally continuing after a 20-year interruption. Eleanor thought of Lucia, of the spark she'd seen in the young woman's eyes. She thought of her younger self, of all the years spent cleaning classrooms instead of teaching in them, of all the ideas that had lived only in her mind with no outlet. "Better late than never," she murmured to herself, a phrase Mrs. Patterson often used. As she turned to go, she noticed Professor Harrington leaving the building, deep in conversation with a colleague. Seeing her, he nodded in acknowledgement, not quite a friend but a respected peer. It was enough. Eleanor drove home to her new apartment, no longer the cramped basement unit she'd lived in for years, but a modest place with good light for working. Her dining table was covered with papers, books, and the draft of her new article, the continuation of work she'd begun 2 decades ago. On the wall hung a framed copy of the problem she'd solved that day in class, the equation that had changed her life. Below it was a simple brass plaque, a gift from Dr. Chen. It read, "It's never too late to become what you might have been." Eleanor made a cup of tea and sat down at her desk. There was so much to do, research to complete, papers to grade, meetings to prepare for, and now a promising young custodian to mentor. Her new life was busy, challenging, and exactly what she had always wanted. She picked up her pencil and began to work.